Father's Day is rapidly approaching, and if your dad already has a garage full of tools and insists no more ties, then I suggest you try this episode's sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Home Field is a premium brand based in Indianapolis, creating incredibly comfortable, officially licensed collegiate wear from over 150 colleges. They dive deep into each school's history, finding unique logos and mascots to craft nostalgic designs. So for a Father's Day gift to knock out the competition, why don't you take your dad down memory lane of his college glory years when he was big man on campus? You can do this by making sure you head to homefieldapparel.com. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. In a galaxy far, far away, we'll call it ESPN. Jay Soderbergh, a visionary pioneer, arose. Wielding his mighty lightsaber, he crafted an unprecedented form of fantasy football content. With his audacious imagination, he broke the traditional chains, deploying the dark force of his innovative podcast throughout the empire. He embraced the role of Dark Lord of the Podcast Sith, forever to be known as PodVader, and boldly proclaimed to his ESPN podcasting peers, "I am your father." Welcome to Fantasy Football Origin Stories, where each episode is a journey back in time to explore the unique experiences of some of the coolest and most influential people in the fantasy football industry. I'm your host, Arnie Chapman, also known as the Football History Dude. Now, I love fantasy football, and I want you to come along with me to explore the yesteryear of the armchair gridiron. So hop on board my DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour. This time as we step up the DeLorean, the date is December 4th, 2019. We're sitting here listening to the latest episode of the Football History Dude podcast. It's episode 93, but it was only my 6th ever interview on the show. I had Jay PodVader Soderbergh on to talk about the creation of podcasts at ESPN, and let's just say it's safe to say he was a major influence, including everybody over there at ESPN, to almost every person in the fantasy football industry in some way or another nowadays. Again, that's episode 93 of the Football History Dude podcast to hear even more PodVader stories. But in this episode, we're going to take a little bit of a different turn. We're going to focus even more on fantasy football with PodVader's fantasy football origin story. But first, we got to get into the fantasy football history moment for this episode. It wasn't that long ago because 2019, the date of the episode release, it was easier to pull up some data from then. So we're going to hop in the DeLorean. We're going to go back to September 7th when Matthew Berry's top 200 PPR list was released. Overall, I guess when you look at the results, it was pretty accurate. I mean, the top three, just as an example, had Saquon, Zeke, and then Christian. That year, well, Christian McCaffrey blew up and way dominated everybody out there for 471 PPR points. Then Lamar Jackson had his MVP year with 416 PPR points, and Michael Thomas at number 3 for 375. That actually might mean something later when we talk about how things have shifted over the past 4 years. The second place running back was Aaron Jones at 315. So Christian had a whopping 156 more points, PPR that is, than the next running back. I mean, I wonder where he'll end up this year. He's, depending on what board you're looking at, considered possibly the top running back again. Only time will tell, and it's too early for me to give you my official rankings for the 2023 season. But just for giggles, let's look back at 2019. The top 200 list for Matthew Berry, he had 8 running backs in his top 12 PPR. He only has 5 so far this year. Fantasy Footballers only have 4. Some sites even have less. So even in just 4 little years, it's crazy how things change so fast. I mean, we're talking about even quarterbacks. Of course, you had back in the day, the dinosaur guys were all like, well, let's take a whole bunch of quarterbacks in the first round because they score the most points. Then slowly it shifted to the whole late round quarterback thing where that's where you win it because you have the every waiver wire wonder kind of guy. But now it's like if you don't get the top 4 or 5, we got the Allens, Mahomes, the Hurts, the Lamars. Well, I mean, it depends on Lamars. I guess if you put in the Burrows, 3, 4, 5 guys. If you don't have one of those, you might be toast. But we'll see how it all goes down in 2023. And this week's guest, well, he's seen it all over the past couple of decades in podcasting, and fantasy sports podcasting is where he started. But before we get into that, if you do like this show, you got to make sure you share it with at least one person and mash that subscribe button, your podcast player of choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest out the press episodes, each and every week. And if you do share it with somebody, you can even send them over to fantasyfootballoriginstories.com so they can learn more. But now, let's go ahead and get in the interview with Jay Soderberg, forever to be recognized as PodVader.
Yeah, no, I'm not into that. At any rate, like I said, so the first episode for the listener of the show that's hitting us up now, if you want to listen to the original interview on the Football History Dude podcast, that's over at episode 93. But without further ado, let's talk to PodVader about some fantasy football. Let's start off with, what was your first just recollection or memory of like fantasy football in general, whether it was playing or even hearing about the sport?
It was, I know I was playing fantasy football well before I was podcasting about fantasy football. Cause I remember playing it on Yahoo, not on ESPN, and, just having a ball.
Yeah, so when you started, it was actually in the era, though, of having like the draft or the thing being calculated online. It wasn't like the old guys that are saying, yeah, I chiseled my roster in stone and I gave it to the pigeon carrier and he knocked it over to the dude over there, the Tyrannosaurus or whatever it is.
Not quite that old, but I was probably right there, like the first time it was ever all online when you could draft online. You didn't have to be in a room with a bunch of dudes. I was probably one of the first people there playing fantasy football at that point.
Yeah, for a guy who has a fantasy football origin story show, I keep saying this. I don't know for sure when I actually learned fantasy football, for instance. I'm pretty sure basketball was my first. I used to play baseball rotisserie at some point in time. I just recall sitting in math class early in high school, printing out these basketball, it was like salary cap, and me and my buddy Mark would print off the salary caps, and then we would try to use math, of course, to figure out like the best possible roster coming up. But I can't recall if it was like a online thing or how. I'm assuming it was online because we printed them off from the internet, but I don't remember the site or any of that stuff. My fantasy football life really got heavily into it. Speaking of why we brought you on the show to talk about some of your days in the podcast production, but I really got into it right there near the beginning of the whole podcast world, and it kind of took from there. Let's go with that. Let's just dive into it. Let's go in that DeLorean. Let's go to the beginning. Like, when did you get to the point where like, you know what, I'm going to get into some kind of industry, or how did you lead from your point of conception of the whole being interested in fantasy football to then now talking on the fantasy football origin stories?
Well, not to completely leave those first days of fantasy, but I was working the overnights at ESPN Radio, and a good portion of that time was all pre-recorded. So I was just sitting there babysitting the tape, which, not to date myself, I'm sure anybody right now is like, tape? What's tape? Isn't that what you'd use to, keep stuff together? There was nothing else to do other than, troll around on what was an internet back then. And, since I was at ESPN, I played every fantasy sport. I was playing baseball, football, basketball, hockey, anything. And it was all on Yahoo because my email address is still a Yahoo email address. So, I'm whatever. That goes a long way. So I was at ESPN Radio. And then there was just that day, into my career when I got called into the office and the boss said, we got to do this thing called podcasting. And of course the answer was, what's a podcast? And the response was, we don't know either, but you're going to find out. So that was I was the right guy at the right time at the right place, and did my research, figuring out what a podcast was. Adam Curry and Leo Laporte were two OG podcasters. They were the only ones really talking about podcasting in a public sense. So it was studying what those guys were doing and trying to figure out, how do I take what Leo is doing for tech information, tech news, and apply it to sports. And it wasn't that difficult, quite honestly, because it was just sort of, let's set up a news segment. Let's set up an email segment. Let's set up an interview segment. Boom, done. We're golden. We can switch and match these however we want. If we got a big guest, we'll put him first. If we, got a great email, we'll put that for. I don't think we ever did the emails first, but that was the whole idea. It was just, let's take everything, narrow cast it to the sport, and it just happened that fantasy sports at that time was a big priority for ESPN because they had just hired this guy named Matthew Berry.
Yeah, and we had him on a previous episode. We talked about some of the whole at the beginning there, and maybe you can shed a light. Like you said, hey, what's this podcasting thing? I mean, we're going from what's this podcasting thing to let's start a fantasy football podcast. I mean, like, what was it like for the buy-in around maybe not the industry, but just in the general population?
Well, it's funny. Hindsight being 2020, I don't think sports podcasters get enough credit for the evolution of the podcasting medium, quite honestly. We were right there, right at day one of podcasting. And I know because I was there. It's a lot of focus gets put on NPR and This American Life, and rightfully so. But ESPN as a company was all in on podcasting. We had a podcast for baseball, for football, for fantasy baseball, for fantasy football, for basketball, for hockey, for college sports, both basketball and football. There were a lot of podcasts, and it felt like a new one kept getting added to my plate almost every day. At one point let's put it this way. I had my fingerprints on 27 original podcasts that came from ESPN, whether I was directly the producer or I was in a quote unquote, I'll say an executive producer role, someone sort of overlooking the production process of another one. And honestly, it was even before podcasting. ESPN was doing online shows, and Fantasy Focus happened to be one of them. And it was hosted by Eric Karabell and I can't remember the gentleman's name. Unfortunately, I wish I could. I never worked with him. He left to go to Yahoo, interestingly enough. But that was all online. So it wasn't a podcast because it wasn't an MP3 file attached to an RSS feed, but it was an online only show. You had to go to ESPN.com to go and listen to this particular program. And there were a couple of them. There was the original Baseball Today podcast was an online only radio show. And that, evolved into becoming a podcast. So ESPN was all in on podcasting right from the beginning. From the community standpoint, I think, and especially from a sports and fantasy football standpoint, I think once everyone saw the worldwide leader doing it, they realized they had to do it too. And the audience was enormous. I remember, one of our earliest jokes on the Fantasy Focus, as we were looking at what were the Apple podcast charts back then, it was called iTunes. I don't know if people know that or not. Have we reached the point where we've forgotten that it used to be called iTunes? But when we used to look at the charts, and it actually meant something because there weren't many podcasts that existed at that point, we used to compare our audience and where our podcast was to the Jonas Brothers. We're like, oh, the Jonas Brothers are arch nemesises. They're ahead of us again on the podcast charts, which did ultimately lead to a Fantasy Focus versus the Jonas Brothers softball game, which is well documented online.
That's pretty neat. Again, the different things that lead. I can only remember. I can't remember if I tell the story. I don't know if ESPN Fantasy Focus was the first ever podcast or the second, because I know I listened to Eric Fisher's productivity show, and then Smart Passive Income was the other one too. But ESPN was the one that I always listened to, like, hearing you in my earbuds and stuff like that, and the whole Patriots stuff. I mean, we can talk about that now that I'm a Lions fan, Patriots, and the foot's on the other, or what's it called? The shoe's on the other foot, or whatever you want to say. But it's just cool to think that for me, like you said, I got into it and I heavily remained into it because of sports, particularly for me, specifically fantasy football. But I could just imagine how other Joe Blows out there, I'm a sports guy. Why would I listen to this technology thing for nerds? But then because it's sports, it comes in, and then now I'm interested. I'm in the ecosystem and I move on from there. I mean, was there like a big blitz by ESPN to promote the fact that it was a podcast, or was it more of like kind of natural?
No. Interestingly enough, there was little to no promotion of the ESPN podcasts. We fought tooth and nail to get any sort of mention at any point in time, either on radio or on TV. It took a lot to finally get real buy-in from the very tippity top of the company to promote the existence of these shows. The beauty was, again, because there wasn't a lot of competition at that point, those 4 letters carried a lot of weight. And when people were figuring out what podcasting was, meaning listeners, audience members, once they saw ESPN, they would just click on it because it was a brand that they trusted. And that definitely led to the show's quick growth. I mean, we had, 100, 150% year over year growth in those early years, like crazy. It was just, and usually I tell people when you're given a percentage, be careful, because it usually means the real number isn't that sexy. The real number was still pretty sexy. I mean, the audience grew really quick, really fast, and just continued to grow and grow and grow, up until when I left ESPN. And that was 8 years after we'd gotten things started, 8, 9 years. I don't know. I'm so old now. Numbers mean nothing to me anymore. I got to get in that DeLorean.
Yeah.
Keep track of time.
We'll give you the keys. But I mean, you brought up a good point. ESPN, I know when I first started listening to podcasts, and specifically the ESPN, I didn't know who Matthew Berry was. Like, that name didn't mean anything to me, or anybody that was on that artwork. It was specifically because I knew and I trusted ESPN. And then from there, of course, like any other podcast, so as you fall in love with like the show concept or the host or whatever it might be. I mean, what from the early days, you said, hey, let's have these different segments, but like, can you maybe take the listener back to the war room, I guess you could say, of in between, of like, how do we take it from this level to the next, and some of your favorite segments, we'll say that, like some of your favorite segments and how they came to be.
Well, I mean, Matthew mentioned a lot of this during his interview with you, but a lot of it was just authentic. Let's be real, and Matthew really sort of set forth hey, to be frank and honest, let's steal the Howard Stern, design, and just everything is on air, warts and all. We're going to make fun of Jay. That's just going to happen. We're going to try and give him a geeky nickname that's going to make him even more geeky, and instead ended up being one of the coolest things ever and became part of my brand at this point. We're going to do all of that sort of stuff. And really for me, because I was producing so many of these shows on my own at that point, like I couldn't keep up and keep my attention all on one show for an extended period of time. Inviting the audience to participate and create sounds and send them in was as much as part of the success of the show as anything, because it gave the audience ownership of what they were listening to. The greatest compliment that we had ever received, especially in the early days, was from a radio DJ who was renting out one of the studios nearby. And he had to use the studio we were using for the Fantasy Focus. And so he was hanging out before his time listening to the end of the show. And when they finished, he was like, guys, I know nothing about sports. I know nothing about fantasy sports, to say the least, but I could sit and listen to you guys all day long. Like, that's how good the chemistry was between Matthew and Nate Ravitz. Those two obviously were buddies. Matthew brought in Nate to ESPN to help him out with the initiative he had on the .com side. And I was just the guy there trying to keep everything, keep them in check as best as I could. That's why I was the comedy goalie. I was the one that was like, no, that joke goes a little too far. we got to protect the brand a little bit here. There were all sorts of things. I wouldn't let Matthew get away with, lazy. We called it the lazy analyst. Well, and Matthew will admit this because he does it. I don't think he does it as much anymore, but he used to, especially in the other day. Well, he's not top 10, but he's top 12. We just spent 20 minutes arguing over the value of this player over 2 spots. I mean, what was that? He used to do that all the time. It was
I can hear it in my head, actually. Yeah, because when you say that, I just like, I can remember moments of sitting on the lawnmower just hearing that and just.
And they used to be knockout dragouts, right? Nate wouldn't let him get away with it. Nate would go at him toe to toe, and they'd be like, to the point where I was like, whoa, are things going to get a little too far here? And then next thing you know, he would say something, well, he's not top 10, but he's top 12. Like, what? We just spent a half an hour talking about the value of this guy, and it's really not that far off.
Right.
Those used to be my favorites. Or, I think, from an early advertiser standpoint, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the Fantasy Focus is responsible for everyone drinking Coke Zero anymore. I'm not going to say that. But what I am going to say, though, is a lot of people listen to our podcast, and we never had to tell the audience the only way your email was going to get read is if you somehow creatively intertwined in your email the cool, refreshing taste of a Coke Zero. We never said that publicly. And honestly, behind the scenes, we never said it to each other either, that, hey, the only emails we're going to read include some sort of reference to Coke Zero. It just happened naturally. Coke Zero was the sponsor of the email segment. Matthew put his own twist on the copy. And for whatever reason, that one line of the cool, refreshing taste of Coke Zero made it in almost every single email that ever got read during the span of that campaign. Furthermore, Charles Schwab comes up, and their campaign was Meet Chuck. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I incorporate this, money advisor, this financial advisor, into the email segment as well as we did with Coke Zero. And so if their thing is Ask Chuck, well, let's get a Chuck. Well, I can't get another person to come in here and pretend that they're Chuck on a daily basis to ask them fantasy questions. But what I can do is I can pre-record someone, and it did happen to be a gentleman by the name of Chuck who worked at ESPN, to record Magic 8-Ball type answers. And thus, when they sent in their emails, they not only got the fantasy advice of Matthew Berry and Nate Ravitz, but they got the fantasy advice from Chuck. Chuck would give these answers. And at one point, Chuck got, started to become sentient, like the AI that's starting to take over the world. And Chuck started to throw insults back at Matthew and Nate. Matthew, do I need to remind you about the advice you gave about this player the last time? So yeah, I mean, those were, the stuff that we used to do. Matthew brought up bona fide, bonifacio. I mean, that was, I wish I knew, and if you're out there and listening to this right now, I wish I knew the gentleman who created the jingle for that. It was so good. For bona fide or bonifacio, which was a baseball reference. But, the concept was created by Matthew and Nate, just through their banter going back and forth, talking about that particular player, Emilio Bonifacio. But the idea of the jingle came from the audience. And again, that was the brilliance of our show, allowing the audience to participate in that manner, giving them ownership. Playing in the Man's League, which again was spurned by them picking on me, because they're like, how many players are in your in your fantasy baseball group? And I was like, yeah, there's only 9 of us. They were like, that is terrible. That is a Diet Soderbergh league. And so they're like, next time you're playing in a Man's League, which became, a ginormous league, which is what's funny now is everyone plays in ginormous leagues now, which I think is great. But that was all born out of, that was just being authentic, just being ourselves, just going in there, delivering what news and analysis had to be delivered on a daily basis, but just having fun. And I think a lot of times people forget that aspect of what it is that they're doing. Yeah, you're doing a job and you're providing a service and people want the information that you're providing to them. But at the end of the day, if you're not having fun, then what's the point?
Yeah, I'm with you. And speaking of just listening to different shows, those are the ones that we not just tune in for, the ones that we continue to subscribe and come back for and everything like that. And you just so there was like 5 follow-up questions. There's probably a million of them that came in my head. But one of them, for some reason, when you listen to that episode with Matthew, what 1 or 2 like nostalgic moment memories you're like, oh man, I forgot totally about that popped in your head when you're having this, listening to it?
I can't say, well, I remember all of my moments with the Fantasy Focus quite fondly, because, I mean, I would be lying to say that the Fantasy Focus isn't the reason why I'm in the position that I'm in now, being a long-time podcast pioneer and helping podcasters from all over with podcasting. I mentioned the Jonas Brothers softball game. I mean, it's just nuts. I don't know if there's another podcast out there right now that's planning to play a softball game in a minor league stadium that gets filled with 6,800 screaming teenage girls, which, by the way, the noise of only 6,800 screaming girls, I now understand why these rock stars do what they do. Because, I mean, that was amazing when the Jonas Brothers first stepped on the field and the noise that just erupted from the stadium, to which Matthew and I both at the same time had the same idea. It was like, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. But I mean, that's a huge memory. That was a podcast. That wasn't a radio show. That wasn't a TV show. That was 3 guys that were not even in the main broadcasting building at ESPN, in an offshoot building in a studio hidden away in a deep, dark corner of the building, that were just, doing a little fantasy show and, throwing out a challenge to the Jonas Brothers, who had their own podcast at the time. I wonder if you can still find that on the internet. You must be able to. Nothing dies on the internet. And the Jonas Brothers, who had their own podcast, and just, being silly and marking who we had to have battles with. I remember when I left ESPN and was working at another company and reaching out to our other arch nemesis at the Mugglecast. we were always going toe to toe with the MuggleCast on the charts. And that was great, being able to talk to them, just about podcasting, not even about, anything else going on. I mean, you don't hear about that anymore. Nobody, at least I don't. I mean, maybe, are these true crime podcasts going toe to toe with each other, challenging each other to softball games? Like, Audio Chuck, we're coming for you.
Yeah, that's a pretty, just general neat story to think of. Whatever you came into the world as, like, hey, this is what I want to be when I grow up. It obviously wasn't podcasting because it wasn't a thing when you were going to school and stuff like that. And then, like you said, because I had this fun little bit of challenging, now I'm playing softball against, I don't know if they were the most popular at the time, but at the time they had to be near the most popular, group out there and everything. So it's just cool.
Oh, they were pretty high up there. They were tops. They were the top Disney guys.
Right. I mean, they're
which, by the way, just happened to be coincidence that they were part of the same company. By the way, it wasn't because of Disney that we got together with the Jonas Brothers. It was all done just by us challenging them, and then I reached out to their people, and then their people were like, they're interested, and then our ESPN people put the whole thing together and got the stadium, and yeah, it was a fun day.
Yeah, that's actually I was going to ask that. So Disney did have ESPN even back then. I mean, I don't even know how long ago that was that they purchased ESPN.
It was before podcasting.
Okay, so it's been a long time now.
I think I remember I started working at ESPN Radio in 1998, and I believe that's when ABC first took over from Getty. Interestingly enough, Getty previously owned ESPN, the oil company, and ABC purchased ESPN from Getty.
So what, the oil company had purchased them at some point after they had launched, or were they the ones that backed the you don't even know that history maybe?
I don't know. I don't go that far. ESPN history of ESPN, but yeah.
You mentioned something that spawned an interest, and now I have a question to ask myself. Or maybe I'll ask ChatGPT later on. We'll figure it out. But besides that, you kind of allude to it earlier, like, hey, I got this dorky or whatever. I forgot how you called it, the nickname. I mean, let's talk about that. Like, what was, again, remind the listener of the show, the nickname, and like, how did you even get this nickname?
So I had been producing the podcast for about a year. And at that point, I suppose ESPN decided, podcasts aren't going away. We're still going to need a producer. Let's promote Jay and put him in charge of all the podcasts. He'll be the producer for all the podcasts. So I get the promotion. I get congratulated. And it was Nate, Matthew, and another host who shall not be named, who got together and were like, hey, Jay's got this new promotion. We should give him a new title, because producer, that doesn't really cover what Jay's doing. So at first they said they were going to call me the PodFather. But they decided, one, that was too cool. And then two, I told them, well, the PodFather is Adam Curry, and I'm not going to take Adam Curry's title away from him. And so then they were like, well, we're not going to call you anything that could be cool. Let's think of something geeky. Star Wars. You like that Star Wars stuff. You know what? And you're evil. So we're going to call you PodVader. PodVader is your new nickname. From this point forward, you'll be known as PodVader. And I was like, you know what? Not only am I not going to run away from it, I'm going to embrace it. You know what? You want to call me PodVader? Go right ahead. I am PodVader. I am a dark Sith of the pod. And from that point on, like, anything to do with podcasting and Star Wars, and that's my brand. That's PodVader.
It's so funny that you mentioned that. You're leaning into it, because I couldn't even remember what your real name was for the longest time. I just knew PodVader from Fantasy Focus. Then it can.
Well, it's true. When I go to conferences, and I introduce myself, where they see my badge and it says Jay Soderberg, they're like, oh, hi, how are you? And then And then I'm like, yeah, you might know me better as PodVader. And all of a sudden there'll be like lights like, oh my God, you're the guy from ESPN. I used to listen to you all the time. It's really funny when that happens. Nobody knows who Jay Soderbergh is, but if you ask him about PodVader, he still has some, a little bit of fame to him.
Yeah, some clout and some nostalgia. Like I said, I mean, I just go back. I can remember sitting the lawnmower I used to cut, in orange shorts, listening to PodVader and Matthew Berry have at it, going after each other and stuff. And of course, I always remember the Patriots takes. For some reason, I mean, even back then they were starting to win other championships. I mean, we'll not have that discussion today. We can listen to episode 93 of the Football History Dude if you want to talk about Jay and his son or whatever, never knowing a losing season. Something like that. I just remember that conversation we had.
He knows losing seasons now.
Exactly. Welcome to the real world, bro. So as we kind of, transition into the whole getting the DeLorean and heading into the future, just fantasy football in general. I mean, are you a major player still, or is it something that you don't have as much time for, or do you have leagues that are ongoing for a while?
Oh yeah, I'm still playing. I still have way too many leagues every year. Every year I'm like, I'm going to get rid of a league, and somehow I end up getting a new one. I'll be participating in the Scott Fish Bowl again this upcoming season. We've maintained kind of a loose string with some former Man's League participants. We have a little league. It's shrunk over the years, but there's still a number of us that get together to have a go every season. There's a few others. I've gotten into DFS now. So I do play daily football. I am not good at daily football for some reason. I'm still killing it. I will say I still place really well in all my season long leagues. But for whatever reason, on a week to week basis, I cannot for the life of me pick the top scoring team at all. Not even close. And I'll use every single analytic. I'll use every single cheat code out there to try and figure it out. It just doesn't happen for me. Like maybe one day, but that day has yet to come. Maybe now with the AI stuff, maybe I'll be able to do a little bit better.
Well, maybe you can, again, hop in my DeLorean and go steal that Gray's Almanac in the future. And that's a question that I like to kind of nearly close it out with is whether it's 5 or 20 years, I'm not going to get hung up on the amount of years, but let's go in the future and either answer the question, what would you like to see in the fantasy football landscape? Maybe differences, new features, or what do you think will happen that maybe we don't expect?
I think there will be a bigger move towards DFS than season-long leagues. I think more and more people are going to end up playing DFS than ever before. And I think a lot of that will be spurned by, the legalized gambling that's happening state by state and, spreading across country. Eventually, I think every state will end up having legalized gambling. So that will only grow that particular aspect moving forward. I think there's some great, I don't play best ball, but I understand it. And I like watching the evolution of the game, the different variations. I know more and more people are getting into IDP. Again, I think there's a lot of luck involved when it comes to IDP. But, again, to each their own. I just think if you're a football fan, there's enough variation in the game that you can find a fantasy league that fits you and what you enjoy watching about football. And I think even if you're not a football fan, it's still basic enough. There's still enough basic leagues out there that can get you into the game and get you into the sport. The one thing that I do believe is changing sports fandom, and it might be for the worse, is with more and more kids growing up with fantasy football and learning to cheer for players rather than teams. I think we're getting more of a fandom of specific players rather than people like me who are allegiant to the Patriots no matter what. I was there when they sucked before. I was there through the years when they never lost, a game, and I'm here again as they suck again. Oh no, we suck again. But that's me. I don't know if my son's children will grow up that way. I hope they do, because they're going to grow up with grandpa, and my son has pretty much maintained his allegiances. But even my own son was developing allegiances to teams based on the players that he saw in video games. And, I think like I said, as more and more kids start getting into fantasy football, I think we're going to see more and more allegiances to players, specific players, rather than to specific teams.
It's a really good perspective. I didn't necessarily think about it from the aspect of like how it will wreck fandom, but yeah, I mean, teams need to continue to rebrand themselves, because I know myself, so I'm a diehard Lions fan, but naturally I turned into a Colts fan for a while, then a Broncos fan as a side because of my love for Peyton Manning. I mean, my cat down here is named after Peyton Manning after they won the Super Bowl. So it's like, I even at my generation and playing video games and things like that. But then, yeah, I could see things totally shifting. I wonder how like the collective bargainings will go in the future and stuff like that, because of they have so much more weight as the players versus just the brands of the teams. And that's getting beyond fantasy football, I suppose. But as we get...
Yeah, you're starting to introduce me to the realm of articles that I've been reading today about licensing rights and and how TV deals are starting to struggle, and how it might change the sport as more and more people go to a subscription-based streaming platform. But that is a completely different story.
Oh man, yeah, that's we could have a whole podcast on that stuff alone. I'm not at that level of being able to understand, but I could see where it can make a huge difference in things as far as the business side of it. Speaking of business side, so now this is how we'll leave us out there. Give fantasy football a lens, of course, because that's the show. But to the listener of the episode that's looking at maybe jumping into a new realm, of course, I'm going to talk about fantasy football, but through the lens of someone that said, you know what, let's try this new podcast thing. Like, what would you recommend to somebody that wants to just do something in the fantasy football space?
From a podcasting perspective?
It doesn't have to be podcasting, but someone that's sitting there going, only reason why I said you and podcasting was because you said, what's this podcast thing? Okay, let's try it. And like just somebody that says, I'm just a regular Joe Blow. I love fantasy football, but I want to somehow break into the industry. Like I like to leave a little bit of words of wisdom for the listener in that regard.
I think, the main thing that I've always maintained is you have to be authentic. You can't fake it. Don't try to be the next Matthew Berry. Try to be the first you. That sounds a little cliche, but it really is. It is true. Be your authentic self, and your passion will shine through. Anything that you end up doing, whether it's a podcast, writing, broadcasting, television hosting, whatever it is, if you're not your authentic self, the audience can smell that stuff from a mile away, and they'll either embrace the fact that you're inauthentic, or they will spurn you. And you will not build an audience. If you're your authentic self, though, the audience that you gain will embrace you. You will become emboldened onto them. Again, one of the best compliments you can get from any type of content creation is, I'm not a fan of this particular thing, but what you do makes me very interested in what you're talking about. The other one is listening to a podcast should be like sitting down at the sports bar and listening to a couple of people just chatting about something that is so interesting that you can't help but stop you can't help but continue to eavesdrop in on that conversation. Like, you just can't stop. It's too interesting. Those are the things as you're looking to break in. And then the other thing I would say is look at what's missing. Like, when you're looking for something to read or listen to or watch on television and you don't see what you're looking for, create it. Do it yourself. I think that's the beauty of what we have in podcasting, is that if it doesn't exist, you can create it. Now, unfortunately, I think in fantasy football and in podcasting, it probably exists. But if it doesn't, and it's something that you believe is truly missing, if you're your authentic self and you create something to fill that hole, or you find somebody to work with that can help you fill that hole, then do it. But you gotta be all in. You can't do it sort of halfway. You gotta, if you see it and you want it, you gotta go all the way. If you are holding back in any sort of way, you're not going to achieve your goal. You have to fully embrace and believe in yourself. Interesting, I say that as I'm wearing a Ted Lasso t-shirt that says believe on it. And believe in yourself and bet on yourself. I've said this to people a million times. I can work at any job whatsoever. At the end of the day, I know I'm going to be successful because I'm going to bet on myself 10 times out of 10. And do I have self-doubt? Of course I do. But I know that if I'm assigned a task, that I'm going to do whatever it takes to get that task done. And if I can't get the task done by myself, I know I'm going to seek out the assistance I need to find the answers to get the task done. So just be flexible, be your authentic self, and believe in yourself.
There you go. Be flexible, be your authentic self, and believe in yourself. Sounds like a bumper sticker, or maybe a poster you'd see hanging on the wall. But again, awesome words of wisdom. It's kind of funny coming from a dude named PodVader, because it was almost those very things that helped Luke use the Force to fly that X-Wing fighter down that tunnel and make that impossible shot to destroy the Death Star. But PodVader, I mean Vader, not PodVader himself, escaped, destined to search the galaxy for Luke. Just like we're always looking for that diamond in the rough. Find that guy in the 7th round that's going to be a top 12 running back this year. Who will it be? I don't know. If you know, why don't you send him my way? And to do that, including anywhere else to be able to get in touch with the Fantasy Football Origin Stories, head to fantasyfootballoriginstories.com. And if you like this show, again, you got to make sure you share it with at least one friend. But next week, we're going to go from the OG of sports podcasting to someone that really, for lack of better, he's like a baby, just learned about fantasy football really not that long ago. But he is making huge waves in advanced analytics and how we look at the sport. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fantasy Football Origin Stories. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please make sure to mash that little subscribe or follow button on your podcast player of choice, then head over to the website for the show notes and more Fantasy Football Origin Stories. That's at fantasyfootballoriginstories.com. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Darren Hayes, host of the Pigskin Dispatch and Jersey Dispatch podcast. I hope you've enjoyed another great episode here on Sports History Network. Now, speaking of sports history, this episode was brought to you by Firefly Books, and they have two great ones for you this summer. For basketball fans, they have the NBA 75, The Definitive History by author Dave Zarum, who's appeared on our Jersey Dispatch podcast recently. He tells about the experience, the thrilling journey of the NBA, from its humble beginnings to its modern glory. Uncover the untold stories of triumph, controversy, and the greatest stars of the game. This isn't just a book. It's courtside seats to over 75 years of NBA history. And for the golf enthusiasts, swing into The Golf Round, I'll Never Forget by Matt Adams. gems. Relive 50 of golf's most memorable moments through the eyes of the legends themselves. From Garcia's triumph at the 2017 Masters to Nicklaus' miraculous 1986 comeback, it's the closest you'll get to walking the fairways with golf's greatest. Get your summer read on. Grab a copy of NBA 75 or The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, available online or at your favorite bookstore.